Ukraine war has made it easier for US to isolate China in the Pacific. So South Korea CNN. A year after Russia invaded Ukraine, Xi Jinping's backing of Vladimir Putin has opened the door for the United States and a partner in the Pacific to shore up sometimes frayed relationships to the detriment of Beijing. In the past few months alone, Japan has pledged to double defense spending and acquire long-range weapons from the US. South Korea has acknowledged that stability in the Taiwan Strait is essential to its security. The Philippines has announced the new U.S. space access right and is talking about just joint patrols of the South China Sea with Australia, Japan, and the United States. Those might be the biggest initiatives, but they are far from the only events that have left China increasingly isolated in its own backyard as it refuses to condemn the invasion of the sovereign country by its partner in Moscow while keeping military pressure on the self-ruled island of Taiwan. Analysts say all these things would have likely happened without the war in Ukraine. But the war and China's backing of Russia has helped grease the skis to get this project done. Take the situation of Japan, the country limited in its post-World War II constitution to self-defense forces. But now it is going to buy long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles from the US, weapons that could strike well inside China. I myself have the strong sense of urgency that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida told the major defense conference in Singapore last summer. In December, Kishida followed that up with the plan to double Tokyo's defense spending while acquire weapons with ranges well outside Japanese territory. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida delivers the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue Summit in Singapore on June 10, 2022. Japanese people have certainly taken notice of the situation in Ukraine, and it has made them feel more vulnerable as a nation, said John Bradford, senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. The nation that Japan feels particularly vulnerable to is China. The People's Liberation Army has been growing and modernizing its forces for years. On Sunday, Beijing announced its military budget for 2023, which will increase 7.2%. It marked the first time in the past decade that military's budget growth rate has increased for three consecutive years. The armed forces should intensify military training and preparedness across the board, develop the new military strategy guidance, devote greater energy to training under combat conditions, and make well coordinated effort to strengthen military work in all directions and domains, outgoing Premier Li Keqiang said in a government work report. China's ruling Communist Party has for years been pressuring Taiwan. It sees the island as part of its territory, despite never having controlled it, and the Chinese leader Xi has repeatedly refused to rule out the use of force in reunifying it with the Chinese mainland. That's worry that China may one day treat Taiwan as Russia has treated Ukraine. Leaders in Tokyo have said peace across the Taiwan Strait is essential to Japan's security. That's really nothing new, but the urgency in Japan is. Japan has been strengthening its defense posture for years. The Ukraine situation made the key element of Kishida's new national security strategy. The expected next steps in this strengthening politically easier, Bradford said. In this handout image provided by the South Korean Defense Ministry, the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan and the South Korean warships seen during a U.S.-South Korea combined naval exercise on September 29th. In the current climate, their leadership in South Korea is watching Taiwan through a similar lens. Peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is essential for peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, and it's indispensable for security and prosperity of the region as a whole. Foreign Minister Park Chin told CNN recently that there is worry in Seoul that if U.S. forces are drawn into any conflict with China over Taiwan, South Korea will look vulnerable in the eyes of Kim Jong un in nuclear armed North Korea. That lead to calls for South Korea to be more reliant on its own self-defense, including some calling for it to require its own nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the Seoul and Tokyo are working more closely together on defense matters, including joint naval exercises with the US. South Korea is also seeing increasing demands for the weapons it produces, like tanks, howitzers, and fighter jets. South Korea, the United States, and Japan held a joint missile defense drill at the waters of the east coast of the Korean Peninsula on February 22. It signed a multi-billion-dollar deal with Poland, Ukraine's neighbor to the west, and the part of the US-led NATO alliance for all of those items, and it is selling them in the region as well. In the past month, the Korea Aerospace Industries has announced that it will sell 18 of its FA-50 light fighter jets to Malaysia. Another operator of those FA-50s is the Philippines. Manila is also a customer for Korea-made warships and offshore patrol vessels, and the web of cooperation gets even more intricate. The Philippines is in talks with the US, Australia, and Japan for joint patrols in the South China Sea, where China occupies islands that the Philippines also claims. And Manila last month agreed to give Washington increased access to military facilities in the archipelago. China may have been its own biggest detractor when it comes to the Philippines, regardless of what it was doing about the Ukraine war, analysts said. Former President Rodrigo Duterte was not a fan of Washington and looked for ways to work with Beijing. But China never really showed any appreciation for that, and his successor, Fernando Marcos Jr., has shown himself eager to work with the US and its allies, the analyst said. It's difficult for the new Marcos administration to justify accommodating Beijing's policy preferences when previous attempts at doing so by the previous government were not reciprocated, said Jeffrey or Daniel, director of the Maritime Security at the Pacific Forum and the assistant professor at Tokyo International University. Beijing's continued bullying, like we saw in the case of the China Coast Guard, blinding Philippines Coast Guard sailors with the laser recently, has only helped to make the case for the stronger alliance with Washington, said Blake Herzinger, uh, non-resident fellow and Indo-Pacific defense policy expert at the American Enterprise Institute. A photo released by the Philippine Coast Guard is alleged to show a Chinese Coast Guard ship aiming a Ranger at the Philippine vessel earlier this year. Chinese pressure on the Philippines has repercussions on the opposite side of the South China Sea, analysts said. Singapore and Vietnam have become even more open to greater U.S. footprint in the region. They don't want China to dominate Southeast Asia, or Daniel said. But the Ukraine war has not been helpful in one key American partnership in the Indo-Pacific, the informal Quad alliance linking the US, Japan, Australia, and India, according to analysts. India, like the other three members, has not condemned Putin's invasion of Ukraine. When the US, Australia, and Japan tried to condemn Russia through a joint statement, India refused. India claimed that the Quad only tackles Indo-Pacific challenges, and since Russia isn't in the region, this topic cannot be broached, said Derek Grossman, senior defense analyst at the Lendon Corporation. But he said that split in the Quad doesn't really distracted from its focus. The Quad is all about how to deal with China, Grossman said.